Welcome to Lesson 3 of Module 1 and 2 for Investigating Science. Our do now for today is where can we go to find reliable scientific information and what are some key things to look for when researching. Pause the video now to complete those questions. So some of you might have been wondering why that was our do now for today, and that's because it relates to our inquiry questions for this video. So we're going to be looking at how observation has instigated experimentation. And to do that, we are going to have to undertake some secondary source research. So it is important that when we're looking at information, we learn today how to find reliable and accurate scientific information on the internet. And then we're also going to evaluate how observations can be limited by the tools available. To do that, we're going to undertake what we're going to call a boot camp today in terms of how we research information. And then we're also going to then look at the observations made by some famous scientists over time. So the first thing we're going to look at is the limit of observational tools. And the first one which we reference to in our descriptor is the switch from analog to digital. So analog is things like reading a watch, things that are not as sophisticated as digital technologies. And analog usually relies on human intervention quite a lot. So when the switch was made to digital technologies, we've seen a reduction in human error. So things like parallax error is actually decreased when using digital tools. And it increases the accuracy and validity of scientific investigations. So while analog technologies are still used today, there is much more weight behind information and data that comes from digital technologies. And then the next is about observing the universe. So, in terms of limits of our observational tools, this part of the universe that we can observe is just a tiny fraction of the entire universe. And so, the ability for us to find information is limited by the fact that we can't travel faster than the speed of light, and therefore, the images that we collect are not going to be able to be interpreted by scientists, and also due to the continuous expansion of the universe makes it really hard for us to observe every part and understand that in detail. So we're going to be looking at a few different scientists and some observations that they made over time that led to further investigations. So I'm just going to do a quick summary here before you undertake some more in-depth research using the research scaffold. So Archimedes is the first scientist we're looking at, and his observation was first made when he wanted to test whether his crown was actually made of gold or whether it was in fact a fake. And what Archimedes found was that if he actually put the amount of gold into water, he was actually visualizing what we now know as displacement, and he could actually find that the amount of water displaced was equal to the volume of an object, and therefore it could be used to determine its density, and is how he found that in fact the crown he was given was not made of pure gold. The next is Alexander Fleming and his observations made when a petri dish had been contaminated by a mold. And what he actually found, which is what we see in our diagram on our right, is that around the mold was an area clear of bacteria. This observation led to more research, and Alexander Fleming was in fact the person who discovered penicillin, and it's now widely used as an antibiotic today. The next is Galileo and his observations that he made of the stars. So his observations were that stars were carried along with Jupiter as it orbited, changing positions along the way, and that the stars appeared to be orbiting Jupiter, which we can see in his records here on the right. This led to further information that Galileo discovered, which led us to further understand the universe and, in fact, Jupiter's moons. So our researching bootcamp, in order for us to undertake really high-end research, we're going to need to understand a few different parts of the web and therefore how we can make Google actually find information that is most relevant to us. And the first that we're going to go through is Google Scholar. And this is where you'll find journal articles. Now, journals are published scientific information that has been peer reviewed. And we can see just in this screenshot here, but your teacher will go through this further in class, is that in Google Scholar, we can actually search for information using terms that we are looking for, and then we can sort by the date. We can look at other citations and how many times it's been used in scientific research. And for people doing legal studies, we can also see that Google Scholar is used for case law. We can also use the advanced search function in Google itself. And Google, due to the actual invention and the further artificial intelligence that Google uses, Google's algorithm in its search engine actually now prefers when you ask it questions because it's tuned to answer those. So looking at the Google Scholar and the advanced search function in Google will be helpful to narrow down your research and find things that are relevant to you. Other things that we look for is some common search techniques that we can make sure that we actually get information that is relevant for us. So making sure that we can look at our terms that we're putting into our search engine. So the first is that we can exclude words from our search. Okay, so if we don't want that information in there, we can exclude those by putting a dash sign. We can search for related information. We can also look for exact matches by putting quotation marks. We can look for numbers. Putting or means that we can search for multiple bits of information in one. And there are much more that you can access. And then the next part is referencing the information where we get it from. So be mindful that science articles mainly use the Harvard style of referencing, but your teacher may have a different style that they prefer, so make sure you check with them which style that they like. You can use that guide there for an actual step-by-step guide of referencing and noting here where commas should be, where full stops should be, those kind of things. But if you're looking for referencing support, those are just two ways you can have the computer reference your information. So the first is EasyBib, which is an add-on on your Google Doc, and you can watch the instructional video for that. That's uploaded to our Google Classroom. Or you can use Cite This For Me. Universities promote EndNote, but there are heaps of different ways that you can cite your information. So when we talk about references, we're talking about making sure that we acknowledge the source where it came from, and then the reference list of a document actually then becomes a source of information for anyone else doing further research. For each of the case studies that we're looking at today, there will be this table. So you can work in pairs to complete this table about the scientist, observations that they made, the experiments that they then undertook, and therefore what they found out. And then we're going to include our reference list at the bottom there to practice referencing. So you can pause the video now and complete those 3 case studies. And finally, our exit slip for today. So there was 2 inquiry questions that we were working on. So how does observation instigate scientific investigation? And then the second, how does primary data provide evidence for further investigation?